Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I wanted to talk about some classics that are less than 300 pages. I guess this video kind of has dual purposes. The first main purpose why I am creating this video is because next month we are doing our Rating Project Gutenberg readathon for the month of November. I'll link my announcement video so you can check that out in case you haven't seen it yet, and you can see the details of that readathon. But my prompt for the readathon is to read a classic that is less than 300 pages. So I decided I was going to find some classics that were less than 300 pages. All of these classics are available on Project Gutenberg as ebooks, and I will link all of them down below with their Project Gutenberg links so that way you can easily find them. I was also thinking though, there are a lot of people who would like to read classics and find classics intimidating, and honestly, when you can find classics that aren't as long, sometimes the length is what is most intimidating. And if you're getting kind of just like a little snippet of a classic in a more digestible, bite-sized chunk, it's a better way to kind of ease into reading those kind of books. So in that case, this video actually has dual purposes. So I have 15 classics that I have included in this list. 5 of them are children's classics, and then the other 10 are adult classics. I also have the page numbers for each of these to tell you how long that they are. I am going off the page numbers from Goodreads because some of these books I have read and I own, and some of these books I have not read but am interested in reading. So I guess not all these are necessarily recommendations, and that I can tell you that these are amazing books, but they are all under 300 pages, and they're either books that I have enjoyed or that I would like to read. Okay, so I'm going to start with Rasselas by Samuel Johnson. This is actually our group read for Rating Project Gutenberg. So if you're participating in the group read, then you can actually just check off my prompt as well. I don't really know much about this book. I think it's kind of like someone's quest for meaning in life and those kinds of things, but it is referenced multiple times in Jane Eyre, which is actually part of the reason why Christy was really interested in reading this book and included it in the poll for options that we could have as a group read. Rasselas is 224 pages, so it comes in well under that 300 page marker. The next book that I want to include is a Russian classic, and that's Notes from the Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is one of my very favorite writers of all time, not just Russian writers, but just all writers. I love Dostoevsky, but I have not yet read Notes from the Underground. I will say I've heard that it is kind of a little weird at times because you're very much in the main character's head as he's kind of thinking things, mulling over philosophy and different things. And so I don't know that it's a great entry point for Dostoevsky or Russian literature, but at only 96 pages, it is pretty brief. So that's one that I've had on my shelves for about a year and a half, and one that I definitely am interested in reading. Next up is a book that was actually one of my favorite books of last year, and that's The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is only 272 pages, and I believe is the only novel that Oscar Wilde wrote. I could be wrong about that, but he is also well known for his plays and his short stories. The Picture of Dorian Gray was actually the first Oscar Wilde that I had ever read, and I absolutely fell in love with his writing. It's so vivid, so beautiful, so detailed, and this is just a great examination into human nature, and it's just a fascinating book. I really loved it. Next up is another book that I have not read, and that's O Pioneers by Willa Cather. This is the first in her Great Plains trilogy, I think it is, but it's a series that she wrote about life on the American frontiers in Nebraska. So I actually own this book and several other Willa Cathers. I have not read them yet. I believe most of her works are on Project Gutenberg, and most of them, if not all of them, are under 300 pages. The reason why I'm including O Pioneers instead of some of her other works is because this is one of her really well-known works, along with My Antonia. My Antonia is a later book in the series, so that's why I decided to include O Pioneers in this list. It only has 159 pages, so I would imagine it's a pretty quick read. Next up is another book that I have not read by an author that I am currently reading a book by, and that's Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. This book only has 257 pages in it, and it is about a town that is predominantly inhabited by women, and I believe it's kind of a series of stories within the town rather than just like a straight up linear plot. But I've heard it's really funny, really lighthearted, and just a really fun read. If you're looking for something a little different, like maybe some sci-fi, maybe you'd like to pick up War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. War of the Worlds is only 192 pages and is really one of those old sci-fis that feels like quite before its time, in the fact that it's actually about Martians landing in the English countryside and then just kind of like trying to take over. I remember seeing the War of the Worlds movie when I was a teenager, and then that inspiring me to read the book War of the Worlds as well. So I remember enjoying both of them, but it's been a really long time since I read War of the Worlds or watched the movie. But it's just a fun book that feels like a plot that's been done more in recent days, and I think H.G. Wells was one of the first to do that kind of a thing. Another marvelous book that's so great to read, especially this time of year, is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I know that this is probably a common book that a lot of people have read, but it's so different from Hollywood portrayals of Frankenstein, and it's such an interesting examination into kind of the innate desire within people to be loved and find a place to belong, and also kind of about the poison of revenge and bitterness. It's only 260 pages long, and it's very beautifully and vividly written. Highly recommend it. If you're looking for something a little bit more on the mystery side, I would love to recommend to you A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is actually the very first Sherlock Holmes story, and it is quite a bit longer than a lot of the other ones. A lot of the other ones are just a couple of pages long, very short stories, but A Study in Scarlet is more novella length and comes in at 123 pages. This is the very first story of how Watson and Sherlock meet, and then Watson observing Sherlock solving a crime for the first time, and just how they come to be companions and solving mysteries and crimes together. It has a lot of great humor in it too, so I really love this one. Next up is a book that I read this summer. It's a Jane Austen story, and that is Persuasion. Persuasion is only 249 pages, so I'm pretty sure it is the shortest Jane Austen work. It's lovely. It was actually her last written book, and there's a lot of maturity in this story. It's about a young lady, Anne, and she was engaged to this man, and her family really talked her out of it because he didn't have enough wealth and prestige, and she listened to them. And then here we are, I think about a decade or so later, and their paths cross once again. And so it's a really good story. I feel like the characters are just very, very fleshed out, very relatable, and it's interesting to read it and compare it to some of Austen's earlier works, because Anne as a character is much older and more mature, and so the story reads differently in that way. And I absolutely fell in love with this book and fell in love with Anne. The last adult book that I'm going to recommend is one by a beloved author to me, but I have not read it, and I have heard amazing things about it. And that's The Blue Castle by L.M. Montgomery. This is only 218 pages, and I was kind of surprised. I didn't think that there would be L.M. Montgomery books on Project Gutenberg, because I thought maybe they were a little bit too new to be on there for some reason, but they're on there. All of her works are on there, and this is just, I've heard such a lovely story about a young woman who just kind of like has been controlled by her family and just comes into her own and starts living her life to the fullest. And I've heard a lot of people say this is actually their favorite L.M. Montgomery novel, and it was written more for adults as opposed to, you know, the beginning Anne books were more geared toward children, Story Girl was more geared toward children, and The Blue Castle is a standalone that was written for adults. This is just kind of an aside, but when I was scrolling through, I realized that there's actually quite a few Agatha Christie books on Project Gutenberg as well, and I didn't realize that those were on there. I didn't go through and try to find page numbers to find which ones were shorter, but those might be an option for reading Project Gutenberg as well. So I have 5 children's books to recommend to you that are under 300 pages. The first one is The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. This one is 244 pages, and I read this book last year for the very first time, and shortly afterwards read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And while The Adventures of Tom Sawyer is certainly marketed as a children's book, I don't think I would have given it to my daughter when she was very young, because Tom's antics are just crazy. Can you hear this purring? Look who's here. She's like climbing on me while I'm trying to record this. So if you hear purring, it's her. Anyways, so Tom's antics are very mischievous and crazy, but they're also hilarious and also quite reminiscent of boyhood. And I have 2 nephews, and the mischievousness really pairs up, but Tom is very clever and gets himself into scrapes, but is also really good at getting himself out of scrapes. I will warn you that Tom Sawyer does have some racist content in it, like the N-word is in there, and there's also some disparaging things said against Native Americans, which can be par for the course sometimes with classic literature. But since this is a children's book, it seems to be less prevalent in children's books, but unfortunately it is quite present in Tom Sawyer, though not as much as Huckleberry Finn. Another book that I would love to talk about, children's book, is A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is such a lovely story, and you've probably heard of it before or seen the movies growing up if you haven't actually read it. But it's just a really lovely tale about a young girl who has been very, I guess, kind of spoiled by her father and doted on by him, and he needs to go away, so she ends up going to a boarding school, and her father very shortly into the book ends up passing away, and she loses all of her wealth and monetary possessions, and as a result is faced with a very different life than the one that she's always had. And she's just very resilient, very brave, very kind in the face of unkindness being dealt to her. And so I just love Sarah as a character and find it a really beautiful and inspiring story, and not just one that I think is for girls, despite the fact of princess being in the title. Okay, having some technical issues, so if the camera angle changed, that's why. I'm sorry. Anyways, the next book I would like to recommend is The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. This is 277 pages, and it's actually like one of my favorite books that I read aloud to my daughter during school last year for 4th grade, and it came as a complete surprise to both of us how much we loved it. It's quite different from the Disney movie, which is not surprising because a lot of Disney movies are very, very different than the source materials. But this is different in the fact that the first part of the book is about Mowgli, just like the movie. But then we dive off and just have different chapters that are devoted to different animals and different stories. And I just found that really, really interesting and really fun, and I really loved all the other stories in there, not just the ones about like Mowgli and Shere Khan and the wolf pack and all that kind of stuff. A lot of that was in there, and some of it was quite similar to the Disney movie, although there were definitely differences. But in general, I just loved all the other stories that were in this collection and just found them a lot of fun, and many of them were quite humorous as well. The next book that I want to recommend is another book that is very well known thanks to Disney, and that's Winnie the Pooh by A.A. Milne. This is one of the shorter books on this list. It only has 161 pages, and it's just lovely. Once again, it's so much better than the movie, which is almost always the case. But I loved the movie when I was a kid, and then when I was a little bit of an older kid, I read the book for the first time, and immediately Eeyore just became my favorite character. He's so funny and just so incredibly sarcastic in the books, and that same level of humor is not there in the movies. It's definitely, I feel like, better. It's very whimsical, very childish, and so I think maybe for some people you might need to be in a certain mood to want to read it. but I just find it really heartwarming and hilarious and just like a really good, nostalgic, comforting read. The last book that I'm going to recommend is another children's classic that may be nostalgic to some as well, and that's The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. This book has 197 pages in it, and it is just so beautifully written. It's about these woodland creatures and the friendship that they develop. They have one friend, Toad, who is just crazy and off the rails, and they basically have to have an intervention for him. And then, you know, there's other animals and other friendships that are happening. There's a badger and a water rat and a mole and just their friendship. And it's just such a lovely story. There's just a lot of beautiful, beautiful nature descriptions. It's actually one of my favorite books to read in springtime. So maybe this time of year is not the best to recommend it, but you know, it actually takes place over the course of a year, I think. So there's wintry scenes and fall scenes as well, but it opens at springtime, and it's just such a lovely opening chapter, and it's so atmospheric, and I just love the friendship in this story, and I just think it's just a wonderful story. Well, there you have it. There are 15 classic books, 10 adult, 5 children, all under 300 pages, and also all available on Project Gutenberg. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. Are any of these books ones that you have read? And do you have any other recommendations of classic books that are 300 pages or less? Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.